It's a rematch and a meeting of the last two teams to represent the National League in the World Series as the top-seeded Braves will face the wild card Phillies in the NLDS. This is BPTV, Cory McCartney and Grant McAuley with you. And Grant, there seems no more fitting opponent for the Braves than the one that penned their unceremonious exit from the postseason a year ago.
Yeah, it kind of felt like it was going to come down to this. I mean, there was some, perhaps, I don't know if glimmer of hope is the operative phrase, though, but for the Marlins, they certainly had one, but they were unable to get through the Phillies at Citizens Bank Park, and now the Braves are going to have to task themselves with doing something they could not do a year ago. But, Corey, as we've seen all year long, this is a very different Braves team than we were talking about this time last year.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into a diatribe about whether or not they should be reseeding after the first round. It just seems slightly crazy to me that the Braves end up facing this team again, and it will all get started Saturday at Truist Park with a 6:07 first pitch. Game 2 will be Monday at the same time in this best-of-5 series. The Braves won the regular season series 8-5 and are out to an MLB best 104 wins, outscored Philly 74-58 across those 13 games. So let's dive into who has the edge in the lineup, rotation, and bullpens as these NL East rivals meet for the third time in the postseason. And for what it's worth, the Phillies claim both of those previous matchups, winning obviously last year, as well as the 1993 NLCS. And let's start off with the lineups, Grant, where the Braves led the majors in nearly every major category, including F4 homers, runs average, OBP, slugging, weighted on base average, weighted run created plus. They also had the hardest high hit rate, the highest barrel rate, and the highest average exit velocity. The Phillies, they only accumulated higher numbers than the Braves in 3 categories: walks, strikeouts, and despite Ronald Acuna Jr.'s league-leading total, steals. And if you go based on OPS and F4, the only spots where the Phillies were better in the regular season than the Braves were at catcher with JT Realmuto, and that's only if Travis d'Arnaud and Sean Murphy's not back there behind the plate, shortstop with Trey Turner, and left field with Brandon Marsh. That being said, the Phillies leader in F4, Bryson Stott at 3.9, would have been 6th on this Braves team. The edge, I think, in this department, Grant, is very clear.
Yeah, I don't know if this question is rhetorical or not, if it needs a response, but I will say this. The Braves lineup, as we've talked about all season long, and I'm sure as everyone's well aware by their gaudy offensive numbers, the number of records they set both for the franchise and matching the MLB mark in home runs, all of the things that we could spend the next 15 minutes talking about gives the Braves lineup an edge over the Phillies. But what Philadelphia does have is a capable counterpunch to what the Braves are able to do, because they do have some proven sluggers. They do have a good lineup. And, of course, they play in a ballpark that's conducive to that group having some success. But they're not going to get to start in that ballpark. They're going to start in Atlanta. So can the Braves do what they need to do, score all the runs that they possibly can, and support the pitching staff, which I know we're going to get to in a minute? I think the answer to that has been proven to be yes. This Braves team can score runs. It's not just boom or bust. It's not just home runs and strikeouts this year. The Braves were second in MLB in strikeouts a year ago. They were 25th this year. You talk about the analytics you brought up at the end, or the advanced stats that talk about the barrel rate, the hard hit rate, all of those things. That's the underlying factors in the Braves' success. It's a reason they could lead Major League Baseball in batting average and runs scored and home runs and OPS, and on down the line it goes. I just feel like, as much as I want to say, somebody has a chance to match up with the Braves offensively, because I'm just trying to guard my own expectations, I just don't know that you can make that case for anybody, Corey. The Braves offense is simply the best in baseball, and they're going to count on that to carry them as far as they can go this October.
And you mentioned that counterpunch. I mean, certainly Kyle Schwarber had 47 home runs that were second only to Matt Olson's 54. He can make some noise. Bryce Harper hit 64% above league average in the second half, and that was the 8th best mark in the league. Trey Turner had the 9th best F4 after the break. They just can't match the depth of this Braves lineup. Moving on to the rotation, in the wild card round, the Phillies were back to the recipe that led them to the World Series a year ago, and that's Aaron Nola and Zach Wheeler tossing scoreless innings. They combined for 13 2/3 inning pitch to oust the Marlins. 1 earned run, 11 strikeouts, 1 combined walk. And as we turn our attention to who has the edge in that starting staff, I mean, I think this is where things get very interesting, because behind Nola and Wheeler, along with Ranger Suarez, Christopher Sanchez, and Taijuan Walker, the Phillies led the majors in rotation F4, and it was by a considerable margin. They had more than a 6 WAR lead on the next NL team, or 8 WAR ahead of the Braves. But the one major factor, and I know you've pointed this out on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it now, is the benefit that the Braves could have in this series, and that's the days off, with 3 potentially, if this goes 5 games. That could mean Spencer Strider and Max Fried end up pitching 4 games between them. I mean, that could help the Phillies as well, but it certainly allows the Braves to put their best foot forward depending on how long the series goes.
Yeah, and that was going to kind of be my point, is that while you can make a very good case that the Phillies have the edge in rotation, and I wouldn't argue over the course of the regular season, because we watched the Braves have to kind of struggle to put together 5 guys to start, every single week that we were going through it. There seemed to be new names and changes, and obviously the injuries to Max Fried and Kyle Wright certainly affected the Braves' rotational plans, and still do to this point, because Max Fried is dealing with a bit of a blister issue that I'm not overly concerned about. But Kyle Wright does not seem to be a factor at all in the Braves' rotational plans, and that's something I wouldn't have guessed, 6 months ago when we were getting started with the season, or at the very least, way back in February when the teams reported for spring training. But the Phillies, you can give them the edge in the pitching, but why I would say that it goes to more of a push is that they had to use Wheeler and Nola to win the wild card series, which means that Wheeler can't start until game 2, which puts all the pressure on Ranger Suarez, which, as you come back to the Braves again, does give them that opportunity to use 2 of their best starters, really their 2 best starters, multiple times in a 5-game series, each of them. Now, you hope, if you're the Braves, that you win and it doesn't take 5 games, because you prefer it not to. But if you were looking for the Braves to somehow find a way to make up ground, rotationally speaking, I think that's exactly what they've done, thanks in part to the schedule, but also the fact that the wild card teams do have to expend some of their major bullets and some of their major assets to make sure that they move on to the next round.
Yeah, and you mentioned Fried's blister issue, and that's going to be a major storyline to watch, especially if he has to start multiple games. If he's asked to go, to game 2 to game 5 on 4 days rest, if it goes that long, that's going to obviously be a major point of emphasis. I think there's also the fact that Bryce Elder struggled in the second half. They 5.11 ERA, 5.68 after calendar hit September. So did they go with Bryce Elder? Do they end up going with an opener? Is that where we see Kyle Wright factor in? I think, I think clearly you have to give the Phillies the edge here because they have fewer question marks. They have the league's F4 leader among starters in Wheeler. They already showed that their formula works in the postseason, but if the Braves can get 4 starts between Fried and Strider in a potential 5 games, I think that gets no better for Atlanta with Charlie Morton out. Let's go back to the bullpen here. And 4 years ago, the Phillies bullpen was an unmitigated disaster. They were 28th in F4 in 2021, the same in 2020. But after a top 10 finish last year, they're 3rd overall, second only to the Dodgers this season. The Braves, meanwhile, were 10th in that department. They had 1 reliever in the top 50 in F4, and that's AJ Minter. Meanwhile, the Phillies had 2 in Jeff Hoffman and Jose Alvarado, and that was 2 in the top 25. Alvarado was 3rd in Ks per 9. They also have a very intriguing weapon that the Braves have not seen yet in rookie Orion Kirkring, who has just that nasty sweeper. Who has the edge here in your mind?
Well, I think the Phillies have the edge in the bullpen, but I don't think it's a huge gap between the 2 teams. I know that the Braves had a rough September as far as that bullpen is concerned, but I look at the way that you manage in October a lot differently than the way they were managing in the final couple of weeks, when I know there were some lumps that got taken. And I know that some of the Braves' bigger name relievers also had a couple of bad outings over the course of that last month. But I would go with more of the Braves' body of work through the middle point of September, more so than I would what happened over the last couple of weeks. And look, there's no way to look at these September splits for the Braves pitching staff and say, okay, well, they're doing pretty well. They were not doing well. It was not a great month of September, which of course leads people to look at the month of October and think, is this what we have in store? But you managed the postseason completely differently. And keeping in mind, in 2021, the Braves night shift wasn't really born until the lights were brightest and the innings were the biggest and the games were the most important. Who's to say that a group that's headed by Raisel Iglesias and AJ Minter and Pierce Johnson and Joe Jimenez can't kind of recreate some of that magic? Now, you're going to need some other performances. Where does Kyle Wright fit into this? Can he give you multiple innings to help bridge the gap in the middle that gets you to those back end arms? The same thing that we're saying about the starting rotation, having the chance to reset. You don't have to burn through your relievers day after day after day, because they're going to get that day off in between. So I feel like they can be used more. And October is when you're going to lean on your high leverage guys the most to try to ride this thing out over 3 series and, end up where you want to end up, which is holding that trophy at the very end of the season. So I feel like the Phillies, a long story short, may have had the way better numbers, but at this time of year, I think you can kind of put that off to the side. And much like Matt Olson said for the Braves offense, I'll say it again for every stat that you look at, it all goes back to 0 in the postseason. Do the Braves have the horses to get it done with the other components, particularly the offense? I think that they do. And I think that this bullpen has the players capable of doing it, but can they match a club like the Phillies that did put up some really great numbers out of their bullpen over the course of the last 6 months?
Well, to the Braves' credit, I mean, Pierce Johnson was fantastic after the acquisition, a .76 ERA, had 12 1.7 Ks per nine. And the Braves, I think you can say they certainly have a lot less of a debate over who's going to close out games. Horacio Iglesias finishing ninth in save. The Phillies, they had 8 different players get saves during the regular season. They obviously used both Craig Kimbrell and Gregory Soto in that role against the Marlins in the wild card round. I think having the more dominant option there does weigh in the Braves' favor, but collectively, I mean, the numbers say the Phillies bullpen has been better. They were strong against Miami, allowed 4 hits and 4 1/3, 1 garbage time run in the 9th inning. So I think they certainly had the edge in that department as well. So let's bust out those crystal balls, tarot cards, or whatever it is that you might have handy over there, Grant, because a year ago, the Phillies bounced the Braves in 4 games in a series where, I mean, basically everything that could have gone went wrong for the Braves. How will this series play out?
I'm going to go Braves in 4 in this one. I think the Phillies are a very worthy opponent, but I think that Atlanta has enough firepower offensively in particular to match or be well beyond what the Phillies are capable of doing. It's going to come down to run prevention. I know that a lot of people like to say, well, good pitching beats good hitting every time. I'm not so sure that that's true. You've got to have a good amount of hitting if you want to win and advance in the postseason. I'm going to go Braves in 4. I just feel like they have the better overall numbers, obviously, over the course of the regular season, the better overall record. And I think there's a reason for that. They've been able to overcome some of their shortcomings. And I think that at this point, the Braves are in a much better place than they were a year ago from the pitching standpoint, despite the fact that their number 3 starter won't be available in the NLDS and Charlie Morton.
Yeah, look, and I get the argument that pitching wins in October, but this is a historic Braves offense that we're talking about. And in last year's NLDS, they scored a combined 12 runs over those 4 games. And I get it. Wheeler and Nola are good. I mean, the best F4, as I mentioned, for a rotation in the league. But this Braves lineup averaged nearly 6 runs a game during the season. I think that's, they're absolute. I don't care if the calendar says it's October. These guys are going to do what they've done all season long. They hit 24 homers in 13 games against the Phillies. I'm expecting fireworks, especially for Ronald Acuna Jr., who last year had 1 extra base hit in those 4 games in the NLDS. So I'm taking the Braves in 4 in this one. Make sure you stick with us here as the Braves march through October gets just really started, and we're hoping for at this point. So make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and get those alerts every time that we drop a new episode. Until next time, I'm Cory McCartney. He's Grant McAuley, and we'll see you soon, Braves Country.